And Chris, you are there in Michigan. Let's start with you. What is the state of the race heading into tomorrow's primary? You have been out there. You've actually spoken to both of these candidates.
Yeah, can I just say wild? I mean, it's highly volatile. It is unpredictable, and it is the biggest test yet. And this is the key part, the biggest test yet for the progressive movement in the Democratic Party, which has had a lot of success in 2026. Look, these two candidates, Abdul El-Sayed, who I'm going to be talking to at this coffee shop a little later on this morning, and Haley Stevens, are both millennials, but that's pretty much where at least the way they approach politics ends. And if you look at the polling, he is really peaking at the right time. He seems to have the momentum. There's a whole series of polls where he is ahead, and in some cases ahead by a lot. But when you look at a head-to-head matchup against Mike Rogers, who is going to be the Republican nominee here, he loses by 10 points, and she wins by just a little bit. So here we are with the key question. As in the closing days, I might also mention that this race has sometimes gotten nasty. The key question is, what do voters vote on? Do they vote because they like the personality of Abdul El-Sayed? He definitely is a charismatic politician. They like his Medicare for all. They like the fact that he likes to get corporate money out of politics. She has taken a ton of corporate money. Or do they say, what's the electability? Because believe me, people here know that in order for the Democrats to have any chance of taking control of the Senate, they have to keep this seat currently held by Gary Peters, who is retiring, in Democratic hands. And so that's why this has gotten so unpredictable and so fascinating, Steph.
Shawna, both of them were on MS Now this weekend talking specifically about the role of voices from outside of Michigan. And I want to just share a bit of it. Watch this.
My opponent has campaigned on a lot of anger. He has, campaigned with, some interesting out-of-state people. This blogger, who's been very provocative and controversial.
When you spend an unprecedented amount of money trying to drag your opponent's name through the mud, when you spend that kind of money trying to buy a seat for a senator who's going to do their bidding instead of ours as Michiganders, don't be surprised when this gets kind of ugly. We don't play that way. We've been focused on the issues.
What do you take away from where this race stands right now?
I mean, number one, they both have had people come in from outside of the state to campaign for them. That shows what they both stand for. With respect to Mr. El-Sayed, he's had Bernie Sanders come in. He's had Democratic Socialists come in. He's had progressives come in. He is not a Democratic Socialist, just make that clear. And Haley Stevens, who's representing really the establishment wing of the party, has had those establishment people come in, as well as she has the endorsement of the governor of Michigan. So they both have that. The amount of money in this race, El-Sayed's what he is saying is not insane with respect to the amount of money that has been piled into a primary.
Because that's the way the system currently works.
That is the way the system currently works. And I think no matter which one wins on tomorrow night, if we even know by tomorrow night, because it could be close, you're going to see even more money flood into that race because of how important it is for the Democrats, as Chris Jansing said, to hold that seat, to have a chance of flipping the Senate.
Given that and where we are in the race, how do these candidates square off against Mike Rogers?
Well, against Mike Rogers,
a presumptive Republican.
Mike Rogers himself has sort of said he wants El-Sayed as his opponent, right? But, a lot of Democrats thought this was a good idea, too, right? Oh, this guy, he lost to Gretchen Whitmer by a whole ton in 2018. This isn't that great a candidate at the beginning of this race, and he's doing very, very well at the end. My colleague, Alex Rorty at Notice, put a great story. He went to Michigan this weekend. He wrote this great piece about these normie Democrats who voted against El-Sayed in 2018 and are now voting for him this time around. And what their thing is, they've lost faith in the establishment Democratic Party. Like, this is not just a race between these two people. It really is a race between two different ideas of what the party is. And the fact is, the one with momentum is the one saying the party is bad and needs to be changed. And the one that's sort of struggling and on a defensive crouch is where Haley Stevens is, which is like, actually, we can get things done the old way. And that's been very, very hard for her to make that case this entire time.
The Democratic National Committee, it's been well publicized, has been struggling with debt. Republicans are sitting on at least $130 million war chest. What does the success of El-Sayed tell you about what the definition of power is right now. Because in our universe, we often think power is money. That's the opposite of what he's running on.
Well, what I have read is that some of the big donors are holding back because they're not quite sure what they're funding right now. And I think that we're in the middle of an interesting debate right now about, pardon me, where is the center of the Democratic Party? And this election will help it. But it doesn't have a center the way the Republican Party has a center, which is Donald Trump. And so what's happened is it's allowed, I think, the media, among other things, and I mean Fox News, but I also mean MS Now, to focus on the extremes, right? I don't think there's that many DSA candidates out there, but you look at the media, and that's all there are is DSA candidates out there. And the result of that is you put forward a Democratic Party that looks like it's extreme, which it has its extremes, but no focus at all, by the way, on the Republican extremes.
Except, of course, El Sayed and others would say they're not DSA. What they're running on is affordability. And the things that the American people are saying over and over, or at least people who don't even care about politics say, we care about affordability and accountability. And the reason they're frustrated with the establishment is not because the establishment is centrist. They're frustrated with the establishment because they're saying, man, this system ain't working for me.
So as an economics reporter, I just want to think, Jonna, is that I find this whole talk about socialism amusing. I don't think these people even know what they're talking about. I don't think the Democratic Socialists of America know what they're talking about. I think if the discussion's about affordability, look, America has a modicum of socialism already in its system. So what are we talking about? Expanding those programs, perhaps extending them? I don't think anybody is talking about real socialism the way it's understood, for example, or was understood in the Soviet Union.
Sana?
Well, I also think one of the things you expressed the frustration that a lot of the people who've been talking to our reporters in the field are also feeling. And it is a visceral frustration that my money does not go far enough to have the life that I want. And I think one of the things we are seeing in this race is style. It's vibes and it's style. And Abdul El Sayed is pretty good on the stump at channeling that frustration. And the question is, does that work in the general election, plus what he is actually running on, the Medicare for all of that kind of stuff? Does that work to actually bring people to his side if he were to win tomorrow? But I think that idea, no matter which of the races we're talking about, the candidates on the Democratic side who can channel the frustration, not just at President Trump, but at the fact that do they feel their pain? I hate to go back to that. I know I was a child when that was a big, statement, but do they feel their pain? And I think some of what you're seeing in the polling is the Democrats who are willing to show up and vote in a primary are saying Abdul Sayed might feel our pain. I think Haley Stevens would say the same thing, but it sounds like a more practical message because in some ways we have made this race about establishment versus progressivism.
Or it's about fighters. Michael Bennet lost his primary, not to a DSA candidate, not to a super progressive. He lost his primary to the state's attorney general who just made the case, I'm a fighter. I go after Donald Trump. I don't sit in Washington disconnected from the rest of you. But we're allowing this narrative to be out there that it's like all progressive or not. It's not. It's about who's going to stand up and fight for the American people who are saying, I can't afford health care. I can't afford an education. And if I get an education, I don't know what my job is going to look like.
Well, right. It's like, who do they believe, right? This has been the big challenge. For someone like Haley Stevens, there are a lot of Democratic primary voters who really want a significant change in the way this country deals with the nation of Israel, especially now, right? And Haley Stevens says, well, I take a bunch of money from them. It's coming in, but, they don't like me that much, but, I can do some stuff. Abdul El Sayed says, look, we're changing this whole thing around. We're not going to do this any more the way we're doing it before. That stuff is really important to people. Like some of this stuff that we're talking about when it comes to this fighting thing, it really is about what is the public going to believe is actually possible. They look at someone like Schumer or Jeffries and they don't say, hey, those guys look like they can really stick it to Trump. They think this guy who Trump is terrified of, he can do it, right? And we've seen that so many times in elections since 2016, that this idea that you're the person who can really blow things up, that's the person who gets a lot of credibility.
Okay, well, Chris, Cori Bush in Missouri did get support from the DSA. They just had their biggest conference they've ever had in Chicago. Is the DSA sort of having this major impact on the midterms, or is this going to be something we forget about 2 years from now and say this was just really about affordability and the American people saying, I want something else?
Well, look, I think it is about affordability. And I think one of the reasons that some of these progressives, including Abdul El-Sayed, have had success is because a part of their core belief is that there's too much corporate money. They don't think there should be any corporate money, PAC money, in politics. And so what argument they're making is the reason that your life is still bad is because all of these people who are in Washington, or many of them, are beholden to these special interests. That's what money in politics brings. But I think there's another part of it that we really have to look at when you see the big landscape. Look, it's one thing to have a victory in New York or New Jersey or I don't know, Colorado, Illinois, right? It's another thing to come to a battleground Midwestern state like this, like Wisconsin, where there's another battle going on between a moderate, centrist establishment candidate, and in this case, an actual Democratic socialist. And they're waiting to see in this situation where we're not talking about a mayor of a city, or we're not talking about a primary involving a House seat, but a statewide race. Can a Democratic socialist or a true progressive win? And that's what the test is here. And I think what happens in places like this, what happens in Wisconsin, is going to tell us where we are going forward. But I don't think if you hadn't seen the successes that you saw already in some of these races, you might not be seeing what you see here. And the reason for that is people want to know it's possible that they're electable. And so the message they're getting, at least so far, is that Democratic socialists, true progressives, are electable, at least in the primaries. But are they electable beyond, Zohran Mamdani in a general election?